So the next question asked, it said, describe the best teaching experience you have had as an instructor. We haven't had very many teaching experiences so far, but I would say that before I came to college, I used to be a coach for middle school, and I would coach volleyball and softball, and I said that my best teaching experience was when you've taken so much time to get a student to understand something, or in a sport where you've practiced so much with a student and they finally get it. So my example of this that I wrote down was that I had worked with a girl every single day on her batting stance and on, you know, squish the bug, all those little fun things that you do to teach them how to bat. And I had worked with her every single day because she wanted to get on base. She wanted to get a hit. So by working with her every single day, it was the very last game of the season, and she finally hit the ball and got on base. So I feel like it was just so much, just happiness because I had helped her and helped her and helped her, and then she finally got it. And then I kind of also touched on how this semester I have a student in my class who it was very reluctant. Like, he did not want to talk to me, or he didn't seem like he trusted me or my CT. But he's gotten to the point now where every morning he comes up to me and says, "Miss Dockery," and has a full conversation with me. So it's just the little things like that where the student trusts you enough to finally come up to your desk and talk to you. So that's kind of what I said for that one. The next one was, what are you trying to achieve in your students with your teaching? So I kind of was a little bit confused by this one because I was like, well, I guess it kind of depends on what you're teaching, about teaching your students, or what you want them to learn, like what's the content. So I kind of skipped this one and came back. But after I completed all of the questions, I answered this by saying, at the end of the day, I want my students to be successful and to be decent human beings. In my teaching, I want students to be able to love learning and to understand that there's an entire world outside of our classroom, and they can be anything they want in that world. So I kind of took that as very broad, because no matter where I teach, what grade level, or PE, or in an elementary class, I feel like that is pretty much what I want my students to get from my class. I think I want it to be way more about, who you are as an individual and the things that you can do and accomplish, instead of, did you learn this science lesson and can you pass the EOG? Why is this important to you? So it's important to me because it's promoting the personal growth of the students, and it shows that even after they leave my class, they can still take those skills with them. So it's not something that, they learn something about science, and then they go to the next grade and they don't really remember it because they were just trying to remember it for the grade or to pass the EOG. I want it to be something way more meaningful than that. How do you achieve your objectives you wrote down for question 3 above? That is, what teaching strategies or approaches do you use in your class that produce the learning environment or opportunities for your students to reach your teaching objectives? So I said this was more set in the future, because I feel like right now we don't really have the freedom to do exactly whatever we want to do. But I said I'll allow my students to work with each other and give them the opportunity to explore content instead of having to memorize and learn content. I place more of an emphasis on behavior in the class instead of grades. In behavior, I mean treatment of other students, trying your best, being honest, that kind of thing. So I feel like every placement I've ever been in so far has been like, you need to get an A on this, like you're so much smarter than this, you weren't trying your hardest, blah, blah, blah. I feel like in my classroom, well, I hope in my classroom, I want to put just more emphasis on how students are treating other students, how students are, developing professionalism, like things that aren't necessarily focused on in the curriculum. And obviously I still worry about grades, but I want there to be more of an emphasis on who they are, like what's important to you, what do you think is fun, how do you treat other people, that kind of thing. And then the last thing says, why do you use these particular teaching strategies as opposed to those that are available for you? So it's kind of like what I said, like I want to center everything more around behavior. So using those strategies, allowing them to work together, giving them an opportunity to explore, all of that is setting them up to know how to have sportsmanship, have leadership. So it's setting them up, and that's a way to get your content while also teaching them those other life skills that they're going to need to know. So from that point, I felt a lot better about what I had. So I took that and I looked at my different learning theories that I had written so many notes on and had no idea how I was going to turn it into a teaching philosophy. And I found that everything that I said and all those questions came back to three main topics. Learning. So that's by the students, like what I want the students to know and how I think students learn and the most important things with learning. The other thing was the classroom and teacher role. So how I want my classroom to run as far as classroom interactions, how students interact with one another, how students interact to learn, and the teacher's role. So what the teacher does in the classroom at all times, that kind of thing. And then the very last, that was one category. And the very last category I came up with was behavior. So I touched a lot on behavior in that one question, but I felt like I took behavior more as, in this context, more as how I'll get students to behave in my class, not more as behavior like how they treat other people, that kind of thing, because that ties more into my classroom interaction and teacher section, if that makes sense. So from that point, what I did was I took each theory. So I came up with, I searched the 5 learning theories: cognitivism, constructivism, connectivism, humanism, and behaviorism. So what I did in the very beginning, before I started anything, I was looking up these learning theories and I was trying to decide if I agreed with them or not. So what I found was that I agreed with all of them, but I think that they all fit in different sections of my teaching philosophy. So by that, I mean that cognitivism, constructivism, connectivism, and humanism, I think that all of those fit into the learning aspect of my teaching philosophy. And then social constructivism and humanism fit into my teacher and classroom interaction little group that I have. And then I decided that behaviorism fit more into my behavior aspect of what I consider the development of the different sections of my teaching philosophy. So from that point, I then looked more into depth into each one, and I figured out which theorist I thought fit the best with each section. So I just kind of wanted to like talk through all of those really quick. So for learning, I said that I agreed most with, well, overall, out of all of them, I think that my teaching philosophy that I can hopefully develop after all of this connects closest to humanism. So I think that humanism, I could have put it in every single category if I wanted to, but I only put it in 2, and it was the only one that I put in 2. So I just think that overall, I agreed with all the theorists that I learned about, but I kind of picked out the 2 that, I don't know, spoke the most to me. So for learning, I talked first about cognitivism. So cognitivism is basically learning when schema changes. So the new things that you learn is how your behavior is not going to change when you learn, but the things that you know are changing based on the things that you're adding and assimilating, all that good stuff. So it's basically the idea that the brain's the computer. So I explain all of this more in the PowerPoint, so I'm just going to touch on all of them very briefly before I talk about each theorist. But the theorist that I spoke specifically about was Piaget. I feel like we've all learned about Piaget 152 times, but every time that I look up and refresh Piaget, I agree with it more and more. He basically says, like, there's some things that we already know. Like, we already know how to, blink and eat and that kind of stuff. So that stuff that's already natural to us and that we don't necessarily have to learn. We were born with those instincts pretty much. But he also talks about how when new information comes into a student, they have to figure out if the information they're learning is something that connects to something they already know, or if they have to build a new folder for it. So I've always thought of Piaget as like folders. So if you learn something new, so example, when I used to teach volleyball, I had a lot of girls who played both sports. So I had girls who played softball and volleyball. And the way that I would explain how to do an overhand serve to the girls is pretty much walking them through an overhand throw. of a softball. It's the same movements. You move your feet the same way. The arm is the same movement. So it was something that I could connect back to what they already know, so they could put it in that little folder in their mind because they already knew it. And then the other thing that he has, so that's a simulation. So you're simulating it to something you already know. And then accommodation is something that doesn't have a folder. You've got to create a new folder for it. So something I struggled with my girls when I tried to teach them how to hit, or, something like that, if they had never played any sport that had that kind of movement, that was something that I had to teach them how to do, and they had to figure out where it fit in their brain because they had nothing else to connect it to. So when I think of cognitivism, I think more of like how the brain works. Like, these are the things you already know. This is how you get things rolling, long-term memory, short-term memory, that kind of thing. So I agree with that because I think it's more about like the science behind the brain. And I think that's more or less how I believe the brain works, not necessarily how we learn, if that makes any sense. The next one that I agreed with was constructivism. So for constructivism, I said humanism had, I put it in 2 categories, but I actually put constructivism in 2 as well. So I guess that is something that I also rely heavily on when talking about my teaching philosophy. So for constructivism, the 2 theorists that I picked that I felt I agreed the most with, the very first one was John Dewey. So John Dewey believed in real life, very practical learning. So he believed that any learning that you do needed to have meaning, and he believed that the way that students learn is being able to show their knowledge through creativity. So it's still constructivism because he talks a lot about grouping, but he also touches on the fact that even though you can group students and have them work together, it's still so important that they have time to reflect and articulate their own thoughts, which I think is really important because, and I agreed with a lot, because I feel like sometimes if you're in a group setting and it's like very creative, you could be with students who don't think the same thing as you, and it's still really good to get that other point of view. But at the end of the day, I still think that there needs to be a moment where you sit to yourself and you think to yourself, like, is that something I agree with? Like, what exactly about their idea do I like? What exactly do I want to change? And I think that as a whole in constructivism, that's sometimes missed. I feel like when I read about it when I was reading through everything, they were talking more about, group work and this, and that. And I think I really like John Dewey because he said group work is great and I love it so much, but like, you still have to give them that time to articulate what they believe after that group work. So I really like that. And then the other person that I touched on was Bruner for constructivism. So Bruner, we learned about Vygotsky. I'll talk a little bit about him later. But Bruner built a lot of his ideas off of Vygotsky. Working together, you learn from social interactions, that kind of thing. But he built more on dialogue and teachers' dialogue, which I thought was interesting. So he talked about how you learn when you discover, and it's about interacting with others, but the dialogue of teachers is what helps students take this new knowledge they're learning and put it into something that already exists. So that was weird to learn about his theory because it connected back to Piaget in my mind, because it was like the teacher's role is to help the students put their new information into a little file or make their own file. So I thought that was pretty cool. Bruner, I also touched on in my classroom and teacher interaction as well, because he says like the teacher has such a big role on that. Like, you have your voice and your dialogue and the words you use and the things that you say to your students have such a big impact on what they're learning and how they're going to remember things. So if I think about when I always go to this example, but when I was teaching the girl how to hit, okay, my entire life, my dad had always told me, like, you have to rotate your hips for power. So the way that he told me to remember that is squish the bug. So you have the front of your foot and you rotate your hips. So that's something that I've always remembered, and that's something that he taught me. But I do believe that teachers can be anyone. It doesn't have to be in a classroom setting. But in this aspect, I was talking about it there. But it's something I always remembered, and that's something that came out of his mouth. So I just think that was pretty interesting because it tied back to Piaget to me. So I thought that was pretty cool. The other one I talked about in learning is connectivism. So connectivism is basically, sorry, I have notes. It's basically you're forming connections through learning, but it talks way more about technology and how we can be lifelong learners because technology exists. I didn't find like a very specific theorist for this because as a whole, I just agreed with the theory. There wasn't very many theorists out there for it because it is newer because of the development of technology. But I just said that it helps learning for the obvious reasons. Like we are given technology just like I'm able to give this presentation on a video and not in front of y'all because of technology. And I just think that speaks words for, how technology has helped us develop and learn. And, we can take online classes now, and that's only because of technology. So that's given us another outlet to learn information. So I just thought that would fall into my learning category. And then for humanism, I had Maslow here. So Maslow, he was pretty much the big guy when it comes to humanism. It's probably like the first one that you'll read about when it comes to it. But he basically says, he basically talks a lot about what humanism as a whole, if I could explain it, is what we've been doing in this class. Like the teacher is the facilitator, and you pretty much base everything off of their interest, and they learn what they want to learn. And it's through interest and motivation that students learn. So that's basically what Maslow says. But Maslow touched a lot on meeting the basic needs of the student. So he basically said that if basic needs are met, then you're going to learn. And the more needs that you meet, the more you learn. So he had like a level of different needs, and it's basically like a pyramid. And if you meet the bottom, you'll make it all the way up to the top. And as you meet more needs, you learn more. So I feel like I agreed a lot with that because I think that learning involves interest, and it involves interest and motivation. And I feel like if you're interested, you're motivated. So I think they go hand in hand. So that was pretty much all for my learning category. And I'll put in my presentation, you'll see a document that kind of has this all. I have it handwritten here, and I might even take a picture and put my handwritten stuff in there, but just so you can see what my thinking was. Like I took these questions and I took the main topics from these questions, broke them into 3 parts. And then I took the 5 theorists or the 5 theories, broke them into how I agreed with them in which part. And then I looked into individual theorists that I agreed with the most. So I don't know if I made that very clear, but I felt like that explains it a little bit better. So my next category is classroom interactions and classroom teachers. So for in this one, I repeated constructivism and humanism. So for social constructivism, Vygotsky, I feel like we've all learned about Vygotsky 100 times, but he basically believes in interaction and communication from others. So I put this one in this category because he talks about how it's the teacher's responsibility to create the learning environment for the students, and it's through this learning environment that they're able to learn. So it's all about social interaction and being able to talk to each other, and then it's the teacher's job to do that, to put them in the groups and to allow them to collaborate and have group work with each other. He also touched on feedback, which really spoke to the PE teacher in me, because I think that the best way to learn is through feedback. So example, if I had a student in my class who, let's say we're doing a learning skill on throwing, okay? And I have a student who's doing awesome. I don't really have anything to say to them to make it better. So I just move on to the next student. Say the student is not doing so hot. If I just went up to that student and said, oh, good try, you'll get them next time, they're not going to learn anything. Like, they don't know what they're doing wrong because they can't see themselves doing it. So this is also comes back to constructivism because it's about modeling. Like, you have to model the skills for the students. But feedback comes into play because it would be a lot different if I came up to the child and said, you're doing a really good job and I love how you're trying, but I think that if you stepped with the opposite foot of your arm, that you could throw it a lot farther. So they weren't stepping with the right foot. That's why they weren't throwing it. Or I think that you would throw it a lot harder if you threw it overhand. So it's just giving them that feedback. So it's not just like, good try, you'll get them next time, but they're able to take the feedback and make it better. So it's through that feedback that you give them that they're able to make those changes to grow from that. And I think that's a lot of what Vygotsky's saying. He did talk a lot about culture and how culture plays a big role. That's something that I didn't dig too deep in just because, like, I agree, but I don't know necessarily if it really fit with my teaching philosophy. Like, I think it's true, but I don't think it's important enough to mention. And then he also talked about how language is such a big tool in learning, and it's through language that we learn, which I also agreed with a lot, because if we weren't, if we had no language in that example with the child who wasn't doing so well in throwing, like, how would I have given that feedback and how would that child have learned from that? So Vygotsky does, I could have put Vygotsky in every single category, but I just chose him mainly for the social and teacher interaction because he talks the most about the modeling by the teacher, the feedback from the teacher, that kind of thing, how that's your role, even though he does believe that the children are going to learn through the social interactions from people. So I also believe in that because if you watch someone throw a ball, it makes more sense than for me to sit here and tell you how to throw a ball. And then the next person that I talked about under classroom and teacher role, or student interaction and teacher roles and all the interactions pretty much, I talked again about humanism, but this time I talked about Carl Rogers. So Carl Rogers was a theorist who, again, believed in humanism, but he believed more in the feelings and emotions in education. He was big in, like, counseling and that kind of stuff, but he thought that we should allow emotions and feelings to be more involved in our learning and more involved in how we interact with others and that kind of thing. So he, again, it reiterated that your learning, again, I could have put him in learning too. I just kind of tried to pick which theorist spoke the most to each section. But he said that, personal interest is what causes you to learn. That goes right back to humanism. But he said that learning self-initiated and that the learning should cause a change in the student. So it could be behavior-wise, it could be personality-wise, it could be, one thought changes, but the more that you learn, he believed that you should develop and change, which I also believe. But the main reason that I placed Rogers in this category is because he talks about teacher characteristics, and he talks about what these characteristics do and how they help the students learn in the class. So the very first one he talks about is realness, and this one is like something that I feel like we don't really talk about, but I've always kind of felt was more important than a lot of other things. But realness is basically saying that you're very upfront and real with your students. Like, if you mess up, you're like, I really just messed that up, we're going to redo that. Or if you don't know an answer to a question, like, say that, like, I'm not sure, but let me find you another answer. I feel like this whole time, I don't necessarily know if I've been taught or I've just watched all my clinical teachers and teachers that I've observed. I don't want to say they act like they know everything, but there's just some sort of not realness there. Like, they kind of put up a front. They kind of put up I'm your teacher, I should know everything. And I think it's necessarily just they're putting the pressure on themselves that they're supposed to know everything. And I don't think that has anything to do with it. Like, I think that you'll make better connections and have, more trust and stuff with your students if you come right out and say, I have no idea. Like, I messed that up. I have no idea. Let me figure it out for you and I'll come back to you, because I feel like that realness is how you're going to make those connections. And then the next one was acceptance and trust. So that's from your students being able to trust you and accept you, as well as, you trusting and accepting your students. It's kind of flipped back and forth. So it's the idea of both of those, going together. And then the last one is empathetic understanding. So this basically means that you have empathy for your students, and that you understand that some days they're not going to have a good day. And they're just, they might score really bad on a test that you thought they're going to be really good on, or they, may lose a point in basketball, or they may lose a game in basketball and you didn't expect it at all. But it's just kind of having that empathy for your students. And then the very last one is behavior. So, for this part, I put behaviorism, and I wanted to speak solely on Skinner. We've learned a lot of classroom management in our other class, but I still feel like I'm a Skinner fan. So I like Skinner because he doesn't punish, but he gives positive reinforcement, positive and negative reinforcement, which I don't know. I know that a lot of people don't like Skinner and they don't like his ideas, but I personally think it works. Like, I think that it might not be the most, like, hallmark, like, cute way to do, like, to manage behavior, but every time that you implement like a reinforcement, it works every single time. So I just think that this whole time, from the time that I've learned about Skinner to now, I feel like you either love Skinner or you think he's crazy and you don't get it. But I personally think that his theory works every single time. So basically, that was it. So I took the different learning theories, and from learning theories, I broke them down into learning, classroom or teacher role and classroom interactions, and then discipline or behavior. I did this because of those interview questions. I pulled out like what I felt were the main topics I was trying to get at. And then, like I said, if I could choose any two theories that spoke the most to me and that I could have put in every single category, and I didn't disagree with anything they said, it would be constructivism and humanism. With that being said, I still don't have a teaching philosophy. I think that all of this has put me on the right track to have a teaching philosophy, but I don't have one at this moment. I just kind of have developed, what I agree with and what I don't really agree with. But this video was more about, or this project was more about what I agreed with. I thought that it would be more beneficial for me to talk more about the things that I felt could potentially make it into my teaching philosophy. And to be quite honest, I am still confused about teaching philosophies. Like, I understand that way more than I did before, but I'm still confused how to make one. Like, I'm still confused how I take all this information and I turn it into one. So I guess that would be something that I would have to figure out, and that I need to figure out so that I can develop one. But if anyone has any suggestions of how I can take all of this information and turn it into a teaching philosophy, that would be great, because that's what I was trying to do with this project, but just couldn't get to it. But I would just say, basically, that would be my final question that I had after this project was, what is a teaching philosophy, and how do I make one out of everything that I just said? But I would also like to give credit to, let me see, Jessica. Let me make sure. I want to get your last name right. Jessica, because I was in a really bad place and didn't really know, what I was going to do. And I was scared that I was going to have nothing to say. So our professor said, oh, you know what? Someone did something very similar. You should go look at hers. Let me get your last name right. Hold on. Jessica Chestnut. Sorry, wanted to get your last name right. But I just want to give you credit because I looked at your project one and I modeled the setup of my project pretty much exactly how you did yours, because I really liked it. I really liked how you went through all the information that you learned, and then you put a cute little video of you talking about everything, which I thought was great. So that's all. Thanks for watching.